Okay, well, this is great. It's almost like old home day. Glad all of you could make it for this really important event. Because it was 50 years ago today that Jim Splain's law was signed into law, which required that New Hampshire hold the first presidential primary at least 7 days before any similar event. And that bill has certainly withstood the test of time. And Bill Gardner is here with us. You know, he's used that law many, many times. And I had the opportunity to use it in 2024. And what it does is it really supports the backbone that's needed to make sure that we hold that first position. We had a really significant challenge in the last presidential primary election where the Democratic National Committee decided to change the calendar up, and they designated a calendar where South Carolina went first. New Hampshire followed its law and its tradition, and we went 7 days before that event. The really important part is that in the end, our delegates were seated at the convention, even though the president, the incumbent president, chose not to put his name on the New Hampshire ballot. He won the New Hampshire primary anyway, and the delegates ended up being seated at the convention. And those are the two components that are important in this process. One, we hold the first primary, and two, it's effective and it was meaningful. And that was accomplished. So, you know, to those pundits that I hear saying that South Carolina is now the first state or New Hampshire lost its position, not true. We're still first, and we will continue to be as long as we follow this important law. When we talk about being first, though, it's also important to understand why it is important that New Hampshire is first. And the fact gets twisted every time we have a presidential primary election, and there are red herring arguments that are thrown out there why New Hampshire doesn't deserve to be first, that the ethnic population is too white, where the state is too privileged, we don't reflect the makeup of America. And those statements do apply to New Hampshire, but there is no state that truly reflects the makeup of America, and there is no state that is more American than any other state. So why is it important that New Hampshire be first? It's because we are the last place in this country where that fourth grader who had a dream to grow up to be president of the United States can actually try and make it happen. It's easier to get on the ballot here than many of those candidates' home states. We're a small state to get around in. The voters here will listen to you. You don't need a lot of money. You don't need to have a lot of name recognition to be able to run a good campaign. And if you are lucky enough to break out of the pack, and there are some lesser-known candidates that do quite well here, being first gives that candidate the opportunity to take that message and that candidacy to the other states around the country. And that's why it's important that New Hampshire continue to hold that first in the nation primary, because we provide an opportunity for the little guy to run a good campaign and also have the voters decide who they think is going to be the best candidate, to be the best nominee for their political party. And that's why New Hampshire is important, and that's the message that we need to deliver to the rest of the country. So with that, we've got a really great lineup of speakers that were key players in the law that was passed, starting off with the bill's sponsor, House Bill 73, Jim Splain. Jim, I'm glad you could make it. Why don't you come on up? And actually, we can give you a mic. Yeah.
Just hand it. Go ahead.
No, be good. No.
Thank you. Coming up here today is probably my final time in the State House after being here for how many thousands of days through the years, 30 years in the House and Senate. I remember my first moments here in early January of 1969. I was the youngest member of the 425 members, 21 years old. Then in the Senate 10 years later, I was the youngest member of the Senate at 31, and all of a sudden I grew older. It just happens. In 1975, when I sponsored this law, I was an old, at that time, seemed old to me, 25 years old. I was hoping that Kelly Ayotte would be here today so I could mention that she was only 6. I don't know if she would have appreciated that quite so much. But in those days, everybody did seem older to me. But I got involved because of what the reason was that many of us who were young in those days became involved. We saw a war that was going on in Vietnam. Some of our friends coming back in body bags. The protests that were happening throughout the country, and a feeling that government was not doing what it should be doing to protect us, but be concerned or be empathetic to us. So I got involved in 1968 as a candidate because of those reasons, and ran for the legislature because it seemed to be the right thing to do. Later on, when it became clear that New Hampshire might be losing the presidential primary, I and others stood up and said, let's make sure we keep it first. And in those days, and you sort of had to have been there at the time, but a lot of Democrats didn't want to keep the primary any longer in New Hampshire because of the interactions and disputes we had in 1968 between Lyndon Johnson and G. McCarthy. We had a contest here, and it was not the most pleasant. Democrats sometimes didn't talk with Democrats after the election. Republicans didn't talk with Republicans because there were protests on that side too. And then, not long after, we had 1972 come, and George McGovern was running for president against a neighbor who we liked, many of us in New Hampshire liked, Ed Muskie, and we had another civil war. And a lot of Democrats just had it. Then Watergate occurred, and a lot of Republicans were not thrilled about having the first nation primary in New Hampshire because that meant more conflict with one another, and they just had it with Washington. So we didn't have the enthusiasm that we have now. So 1975 came, and I put in a bill, and I found an interesting ally, a very good ally, in Mel Thompson. He was a Republican, I was a Democrat. He used to like to put the flag up and down a lot. So I was offended by that. But for one reason or another, we got along. Because even though I was a liberal Democrat, maybe even more liberal in those days than nowadays, and he was a conservative Republican, and true to himself, people about politics was his slogan. He knew that there was a value to having the first nation primary. Because here in New Hampshire, we can put aside the big money being spent by candidates and spend time with candidates who come here asking for our support. They have to look at our face one-to-one, eye-to-eye, and they can't just get ahead to get our vote by hiding behind the podium. They have to meet us in our living rooms. They have to meet us where it matters on the street, not just behind a TV studio camera. So Mel Thompson spent a very important role in helping keep New Hampshire first, because the bill I sponsored at first just said we would be 1 week ahead of any of the town meeting date that we originally had at that time. That was part of the law. But I met Mel Thompson several times during the debate and discussion in his office, and he came up with a great idea, and that was, why not find a way to have somebody make a decision as to when it should be. I came up with the idea, let's have a committee of the governor, perhaps the governor's council, perhaps the treasurer of the state, perhaps the speaker of the house, perhaps the chair of the parties, Democratic and Republican parties. And he looked at that idea and he said, that is a good way to make sure it's going to be political. All they're going to do is discuss it, try to figure out the party politics, and not make a quick decision or solid decision. So he said, pick one. So I thought about it, and I didn't know at the time who the Secretary of State was, but it seemed logical to have the Secretary of State. There was at that time somebody before Bill Gardner. So that went to the Senate after it passed the House, and after some dispute in the House. And then the Senate, Bob Moynier, who was a conservative Republican, took to the floor and defended the idea. He in fact said that some members of the Senate might be against having the First Nation primary, but he wanted it. And if you have Bob Moynier, Mel Thompson, and members of the Democratic Party in the House in favor of something, you had something that would pass. So it passed, and now we've seen the effect of the test of time. Bill Gardner has been Secretary of State for 46 years, and he was able to use his artful abilities to be able to negotiate with secretaries of state and powers who are in all the other states and the political parties at times to make sure they would not challenge New Hampshire. Fortunately, we have Dave Standen, who's doing the same thing. So New Hampshire will continue to be for us as long as we follow the tradition that we've had really for 100 years, over 100 years at this point, since 1913, and making sure New Hampshire is first in the nation. It's not only good for candidates, it's not only good for the political parties, but it's good for the people of the United States. It's democracy at its best. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to listening to everybody else and most importantly, getting into that cake.
Thank you, Jim. You're a New Hampshire treasure. Thanks for being here. I see Governor is able to join us. Would you like to say a few words on the proclamation?
I'd be honored. Thank
Did you hear that I said you were 6 years old and 75?
I didn't hear that. Well, first of all, I'm really honored to be here, and let me just thank everyone here who has fought so hard, both sides of the aisle, to protect the First in the Nation primary. And certainly Senator Splain had it right, that this is not about Democrats or Republicans. This is about doing the right thing for the country. Because when you come into New Hampshire and you campaign, we've all seen it, you have to actually talk to people. You have to go shake the hands, right, Speaker Roberts? They're shake the hands. You've got to answer the questions, right, Senator D'Alessandro? Like, you don't get to just make a speech on a tarmac here in the state of New Hampshire. You actually have to meet the people and hear what the real concerns are from the people in this country, from people in New Hampshire who I think have a great sense of sizing up the candidates. And we've had so many stories of the underdogs. You know, one of the great underdog stories, of course, is Senator McCain, and of course Steve Dupree knows those stories well, of coming back from a town hall and starting with a few people at the town hall and keep doing the town halls, and all of a sudden you've got a movement going. And we give candidates that opportunity here, that to really grow the grassroots and to become a presidential candidate after answering the tough questions and showing what you stand for. So I just want to thank us, of course, our Secretary of State Scanlon, and all who are here today who have, and it's of course great to see Rob Thompson here, and Your father had such a tremendous legacy, but this is also one of the most important parts of his legacy. So to really recognize the work that was done and the bipartisanship that it took to form the First in the Nation primary, to set the tone, and then to continue that First in the Nation primary. So I'm here to read and sign a proclamation on the 50th anniversary of the passage of House Bill 73. Whereas on January 7th, 1975, Representative Jim Splain of Portsmouth, as the sole sponsor, introduced House Bill 73, proposing to shift the date of New Hampshire's presidential primary. And whereas House Bill 73 was amended with the support of Governor Meldrum Thompson and Representative Splain to create a flexible mechanism granting the Secretary of State sole authority to schedule the presidential primary ahead of any other New England state. And whereas House Bill 73 passed the legislature and was signed into law by Governor Thompson on May 27, 1975, 50 years ago today, it was subsequently revised in 1977 to remove the New England restriction, allowing New Hampshire to hold its primary before any other state conducting a similar election. And whereas Secretary of State Bill Gardner successfully safeguarded New Hampshire's First in the Nation presidential primary for 46 years under the provisions of House Bill 73, and Secretary of State David Scanlon has continued that proud tradition with the January 23rd, 2024 presidential primary. And whereas Governor Hugh Gregg and Secretary of State Bill Gardner further documented and defended the critical role of New Hampshire primary, First in the Nation primary, by co-authoring the definitive book, Why New Hampshire, published in 2003. And whereas the First in the Nation presidential primary remains vital to New Hampshire and to the nation, ensuring a thorough and thoughtful vetting of presidential candidates at the earliest stages of the electoral process. Now therefore, I, Kelly Ayotte, Governor of the State of New Hampshire, do hereby proclaim May 27th, 2025, as the 50th anniversary of the passage of House Bill 73 in the state of New Hampshire, and encourage all citizens to honor the leaders and citizens who have preserved New Hampshire's vital role in strengthening American democracy. It's cool to be part of history, but more importantly, the history going forward, where we will protect the First in the Nation primary that we stand by. And let me just say, I'll get that. Let me just, I will give this proclamation to the Secretary of State, and then I want to give the pen. Thank you. That's amazing.
That's great, thank you, Governor. I want to ask the President and Speaker, are you on time constraints?
Yeah, I've got to get back to finance.
Sharon Carson, why don't you come up and make some comments?
Yeah, yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to address all of you on this very important occasion. A few years ago, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of New Hampshire's First in the Nation presidential primary. As the primary grew in importance, other states began to covet New Hampshire's role in helping to pick presidential nominees. So 50 years ago, the legislature mandated that New Hampshire's primary be held at least a week before any similar contest, and entrusted the Secretary of State to make sure that we stayed first in the nation. Thankfully, Secretary of State Bill Gardner, who's here today, and now Secretary of State Dave Scanlon, have beaten back every challenge. The New Hampshire primary isn't just a point of pride or a jolt of tourism in the middle of winter. It is the stronghold for retail politics and grassroots campaigns in a political landscape dominated by cable news and social media. Only in New Hampshire can you be home on a Saturday and there's a knock on your door. And when you open the door, there's someone standing there saying, "I'm so-and-so, and I'm running for the President of the United States. Do you have a few minutes? Because I'd like to talk to you about what's important." You can't get that anywhere else. Candidates have to earn votes in New Hampshire, just as we have to earn our place at the front of the calendar every 4 years. For 50 years, the legislature has fought to keep the Granite State the first in the nation, and we're going to keep fighting. Thank you all this afternoon, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Speaker, would you like to make some comments?
Today we mark a very important milestone. 50 years since the passage of the law that secured New Hampshire's first in the nation primary. I want to make it clear, this wasn't about headlines or history books. It was about making sure the voices of New Hampshire voters came first and stayed first. Back in 1975, when our legislature passed a law that requires New Hampshire primary to be scheduled at least 7 days before any similar contest, it was a simple idea, but an important one, and it stood the test of time. The law has been our shield. It's what has kept this process fair, open, and in the hands of everyday citizens, not just political machines or big money campaigns. Because here in New Hampshire, we believe in democracy works best when it starts with the people. And the people of this state take the responsibility seriously. Voters here do their homework. They ask questions. They expect real answers, not rehearsed talking points. Candidates just can't fly in and wave. They've got to earn it. And that's the way it should be. We've seen this time and time again in how our primaries help level the playing field. It gives lesser-known candidates a real shot. It forces all candidates to listen. And it reminds the rest of the country that leadership starts with listening to the people. This law matters, and every time we've been challenged, New Hampshire has stood firm. We will not back down. We move the date if we have to. We protect this tradition because it's not just about us, it's about the right for the country. So today we honor lawmakers who have had the foresight to pass this law. We thank the voters who keep the process strong and renew our commitment to defending New Hampshire's first in the nation status, not just for the next election, but for generations to come. I think we have an old saying in New Hampshire that says, when you meet a candidate and they ask you for your support, and I think the answer is, well, I've only met you once, I need to meet you at least 6 times. That's a typical response from a New Hampshire citizen, and it's a great response, and I've known many candidates have said, I've heard about that obscure thing that you have in New Hampshire, that I have to meet you 6 times. I said, well, that's true, sir. Thank you, and always live free or die.
Great, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mel Thompson was governor when this law was signed into law, and as you heard, he was very involved and very thoughtful about this process. Mel had several sons, and all of them have been active in presidential primary politics ever since really they moved to New Hampshire. So we're fortunate today to have one of Mel's sons here, Rob Thompson, to give a few remarks. Rob?
It's a tough time slot when you follow the governor, the president of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House.
It's an easy one, come on.
It's a privilege to be here today representing my father, Governor Thompson, and the Thompson family. In fact, there's more than one of me here. 2 of my daughters are here, granddaughters of Governor Thompson, and 4 of his great-grandchildren out of 41 total. So. That's how you win elections. 50 years ago, my father gave 2 words of advice to Representative Jim Spillane. Pick one. That advice proved to be consequential as it set the stage for the Secretary of State to become the protector of New Hampshire's first in the nation primary. But to get to that advice, Jim Spillane had to reach across party lines to forge a common purpose with my father. For anyone here, or listening, who has not read Jim Spillane's story of the 1975 primary law, published in the 2021 Red Book, it should be required reading. I also think it's important to note that one of the representatives in 1975, when the First in the Nation primary bill was passed, was Bill Gardner, who was elected as Secretary of State the following year. Bill and my father worked together in their respective roles for 2 years and not only gained respect for each other, but became lifelong friends. I think we all recognize and appreciate how effective Bill Gardner was in protecting the New Hampshire primary during his 45 years, although Jim said 46, so the Red Book must be wrong. Today, his very capable successor, Dave Scanlon, continues in that role as protector of the primary. And I'm going to cede the rest of my time to Bill Gardner.
Thank you, Rob. Before we get to Bill, I'm going to ask George Roberts, who was Speaker of the House at the time that this bill passed, to say a few words. George?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Governor, friends, former Secretary, President Secretary, Senator D'Alessandro, Representative Spillane, Ms. Dupree, former House member. Thank you for coming. I guess you expect to hear a lot of old stories, so I'll tell you 2 just to lighten up the mood. There's a person that I think a lot of, a fellow named Dick Upton. When years ago, primaries were the control of the parties, not designated by the state, neither the date, the time, the place. And they would campaign early to get people to support presidential candidates. I would say that, in a sense of humor, please, that it wasn't always for the best of motives. Some people dreamed of seating in the White House, becoming counselors of presidents, getting honorary appointments to federal organizations, having then supported the person who won. But what was really great about it is that so many people would come forward, and particularly when we made it statutorily a law that we would have a primary which would be controlled by the state of New Hampshire, obliterating old home rule, which we love to talk about, and saying this is the time and the place, and this is how we'll be organized, and this will give everybody an opportunity to come forward. I have to remember a fella who, it was controversial speaker that was ahead of me, and I was his majority leader. It was very difficult to be a majority leader for a person who was controversial. And then my majority leader knew that too. We were at a legislative conference, and Marshall Cobley and I and others would have the unofficial seminar after hours somewhere in the Highway Hotel or in the conference room where we would be located. And a friend of ours, Speaker Pettigrew from Florida, was thinking presidential at the time. He was the Speaker of the Florida House, a great state, a big state, a state which would have a lot of delegates. And he thought of running for president. And Marshall Cobley said, well, you better get up there early because you're going to have to meet everybody. And he said, well, we're going to have a primary here in New Hampshire. And Marshall Cobley looked at him as he put down his bourbon, or maybe it was scotch, and said, You'll have a primary after we have our primary, and we'll have a primary if it has to be in the halftime of the Super Bowl. So that was the end of it for Florida. So we waited till all the other competing states, Arizona and Vermont and Iowa and others, they were juggling who to get first. And thank God Jim came forward. He's an example of a book. It's called Go It Alone. One person spoke in our legislature. One person put a bill in. One person did his own lobbying. People did follow him. As I say, there might have been other motives. People supporting presidential candidates thought, if my candidate can get before New Hampshire people and get tested, he'll rise to popularity. And in those days it was he. Someday it'll be he or she. However, the point of the matter is that this is more important than probably people now realize. If you read a book called Bowling Alone, it's about the lack of social credit, which is the lack of participation in church, fraternal groups, community groups, social groups, philanthropic groups. And as that lack of participation goes down, so doesn't the total aggregate of the votes go down. And that is a danger warning to this country. The least amount of people who vote, the least amount of people will control. And in New Hampshire, we like to pride ourselves as that you go door to door. Just a sidebar story if I can. Dave Nixon, President of the Senate, hero in the Korean War, President of the Senate, lawyer, renowned by everybody, was campaigning. It happened to be a bad year. It was a Watergate year. Nixon resigned. And Dave said he was up in the North Country, he's up in Pittsburgh. And he goes to the gasoline station, he gasses up, he gives the guy his card, and the guy says, "What's your name again?" He said, "Nixon." He said, "I'm running for governor." He said, "Well, that's one strike against you." And he handed his card back. The point is that everybody was involved then, probably because we had a dominant media, one state newspaper primarily, but we had also the media in the southern tier coming out of metropolitan Boston, where lots of people would watch television. But it wasn't a time from my childhood on that there wasn't a candidate coming to the town hall, spending 15 or 20 minutes where they'd have a parade of candidates go through, and literally everybody would get to meet anybody who was running for president. So, Jim, thank you personally. The legislature thanks you. The public of New Hampshire should thank you. And we should also give a thank to our real champion, the Secretary of State, who fought other states, who tried to nudge us aside, and also today's stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Speaker Roberts. Next, I'd like to call up Secretary Bill Gardner. He and Jim really wrote a lot of the presidential primary history in New Hampshire.
Thank you, Governor, for joining us. Well, I just want to bring a little bit of context to this, why it happened then, and not before, or wasn't needed after. And I'd just like to, the people that are here, we were in our 20s 50 years ago. And Speaker Roberts appointed Steve Dupree, and he was in his early 20s, to be a chair of a standing committee to this day, going back a long time. And the first teenager in the country to serve in the legislature back then. So, and the speaker would refer to us as the Turks, and Steve was actually our leader. And it was both parties. We had this youth group that all the Democrats and Republicans who were under 30 were part of this. So it's a little bit different than it is today. So the context here is that what happened just before that would make people want to have a bill like this to become law? The most significant, influential, and was the primary of 1968. It had the biggest impact on the country of any primary that we've had. And because of what happened in '64, it really split the Democrats, because the governor was a Democrat, one of the U.S. senators was a Democrat, the party chair, all the party committee members, they were all supporting the incumbent president. And what happens is some person comes up that wasn't a very good public speaker, a professor type, and he sort of ignited the state because of the issue of the day that became an overwhelming issue. So he came into the state, he didn't win the popular vote, but he won more delegates. And that shocked everyone because no one thought he would even get 10%, but he actually got over 40%. So the next day, throughout our country, people were reading about this tremendous upset. How could this have happened? Because he represented the little guy, the person who only had a voice, didn't have power, didn't have money, but he had a voice. And that changed everything, because people, no matter where they were, out west or in the south, were like, this is unbelievable. The little guy can actually change the course of history, this is so significant. And at that time, the nearest primary to New Hampshire was 5 weeks later. So there were only 13 states that had primaries, because the party leaders and leading officials usually want to make that choice themselves. They didn't want to have to deal with the public, because that took time and effort. And so now this hits, and everybody is asking the same question. Why don't we have this? Why don't we have the same thing? And that began states deciding to do it. And the very first one was a 27-year-old, that's the same age Jim was when he put this law through. That 27-year-old was Harry Reid from Nevada. He was a member of the House. And he actually got his legislation to have Nevada, now in 1969, be a week ahead of New Hampshire. And it passed the House and it passed the Senate. And when it got to the governor, and we only found this out 10 years ago, because the governor of New Hampshire at the time was Walter Peterson, and he never talked about this. I interviewed him twice about things he did to help the primary, and never mentioned this. Well, the Secretary of State of Nevada sent me the whole packet of what happened in '69. And when I read it, I read the veto message of the governor, Paul Laxalt, and he said, I talked to the governor of New Hampshire, and he told me some things that were very important to me. And so I don't think we should create ill will with another state. And even if we were successful, 4 years from now, some bigger or more powerful state will just take it from us. So I'm going to veto it. And he vetoed it. And that was it until Florida legislature decided we don't have to go a week ahead. We only need to be on the same day, because where do you think the candidates would rather be in November, December, January, and February? They'll come here. So when that happened, the Speaker of the House, before George Roberts, was told by the Speaker of the House of Florida that they were going to do this. And he waited until the very end of the session and then changed town meeting day. You didn't have to change the law, just change town meeting day, because the law said the primary shall be on town meeting day. So now in at 72, we go 1 week ahead of Florida. And at that time, and it was all because of what happened in 68. People wanted to be like us. They wanted to have this say. Because 3 weeks after the New Hampshire primary, before the next primary in 68, the president goes on public national television. And I remember, I actually saw it. And he announced that he was not going to run again. And then people were like, oh my goodness, see what the little guy can actually do. And so that was the context at the time that led Jim to do this. And there's just one, I have here with me the first page of the Time magazine. There was 8 pages, the article, in 1968. This was the first time, and time was a lot different than it is now. And just bear with me. Let me read this to you because I think this is the most significant. It's titled, The Context of 68. In a single week, the entire political context of 1968 changed almost beyond recognition. Out of New Hampshire's frozen farmlands, and we were only about a third the population then as we are now, out of New Hampshire's frozen farmlands and bucolic hamlets emerged a new equation for the Democratic Party. What had once been a cakewalk was now a slashing dogfight. From the nation's first primary and its aftermath in Washington also came new and vigorously stated perspectives on the major issues confronting the country. Only days before, the Republicans had seemed to be the chosen victims of an internecine bloodletting. The Democrats, with an incumbent president, appeared to be headed for Snug Harbor. New Hampshire, with a relished penchant, this is 50 years ago, a little over, with a relished penchant for turning things topsy-turvy, turned them over once again. When the results were in, the GOP had a clear frontrunner and a long-shot challenger. The Democrats, by contrast, had on their hands the most dramatic and potentially explosive political situation in decades, because Republicans were the ones that were not supposed to have a contest. The Democrats were the ones because they had an incumbent president. And the Republicans had this big field. And New Hampshire just turned that upside down. And that's the power of the people. And the New Hampshire primary has always been about the people, the little guy. Not the big shots, but the little guy. And that, we have seen that continue to this day. This primary has served the country very well. The people here come out much higher. There's only one primary, and all the ones that I was involved in that we weren't the highest in the country by a lot. The one that we weren't was Montana in 1992 when Ross Perot was running. He got a huge write-in. But every other time, and usually we're 20 points above. People here care about it. They want to do the right thing. They wait until the end. They don't make their minds up early because they want to see it all, because they want to do what's right. And Jim, who put that law, wrote that language, if he hadn't have done that, we don't know if it would be the same, because the other New England states at that time had decided that they wanted to have a New England first in the nation, and they were working together. And I got to know some of them after I became Secretary of State that were doing that. And there were others. And so if we hadn't have made that law at that time, we would have been, instead of looking forward, looking backwards and reacting. And that's the story of the, and
It's great. Thank you, Bill. Next up, we have Senator D'Alessandro to give a few remarks. To give you an idea how important this day is to him, this is also his 48th wedding anniversary, and he brought Mary Kyle with him, so. 54, I'm sure changed him.
First of all, almost everyone at this day has played a role in my life. I had Bill Gardner as a student at Bishop Bradley High School for civics. Okay? Bill for civics. Mr. Dupree's mother and father, his mother hired me to be a teacher and a coach at Kennett High School in Concord, New Hampshire, and his father was the team physician. George Roberts was in the House with me. He was majority leader when I was a minor member of the House of Representatives. I served in the House with Jimmy Slade, and Jimmy was an active participant, and his political knowledge is well known throughout the country. I served in the House and on the Executive Council with Governor Meldrum Thompson. And those were 6 magnificent years, I can tell you that. They will go down in history. And here we are celebrating an event that's so important that the people of New Hampshire cling to a significant piece of history. We're first in the nation. Walter Peterson told me the Laxall story a number of times. Walter was a dear friend of mine. I worked with Walter at Franklin Pierce. But that was an example of the integrity of politics. The integrity of politics, which has totally disappeared in today's world. But there's a governor who respected a policy that was in place. He respected it so much that he vetoed a bill that would have initiated the primary in Nevada. Could that happen today? I don't think so. I just don't think so. We have been blessed in New Hampshire with public servants who have willingly given of their time and their efforts to represent the public, truly represent the public, to be there when the public needed something, needed direction. Doesn't happen today. So we're celebrating a primary, but more important than that, we're celebrating the ethical character of New Hampshire. That character has disappeared in this country. We've got to restore it. We've got to restore a little moral compass. The Bill Gardners of the world, the Dave Scanlons of the world, they're disappearing. They're disappearing. We're lucky to have them here. We're lucky, very, very lucky, that when they had to stand up for what was right, they did it. And they did it because it benefited the public that they serve. That indeed is the accomplishment of the primary. That's why it's so important that we maintain it. And that's why we're all here today, to say thank you to Jimmy, a truly great American, who was in the basement of my house teaching me politics. Remember that, Jim? That's in the old days. To George, who was at the University of New Hampshire with me. To Billy, who I had as a student. To Rob, whose dad I served with. And of course, the Honorable Slippery Steve Stubery. Steve is, Steve, what don't you own in Concord? I mean, he is an entrepreneur of the highest order, and came from a wonderful family, and as I say, his mother and father were wonderful to me when I was at Kennett High School in Conway. And to all of you, It's been a long afternoon, I understand that. Thanks for putting up with the boring nature of our diatribe. But indeed, I hope you all are happy, healthy, you're going to have a great American Day, and you appreciate the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou, and I don't think I could introduce Steve Dupree any better than you just did.
At this, I'm going to steal a McCain line. At this point in the proceedings, I feel like Zsa Gabor's seventh husband on his wedding night. I know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to make it memorable, so I'll be short. First, it's great to be here with everybody. I owe thanks to Speaker Roberts, who had more faith in 19 and 20 and 21 and 22-year-olds running as a tribe than he ever should have. How I got to be a committee chairman is beyond me, but I still appreciate it. And of all the great speakers we've had, everybody who serves in the House owes George Roberts a debt of gratitude, which I said when we dedicated his portrait, for being the person who modernized the legislature. Those of you who aren't old enough don't remember roll calls took 20 minutes and we'd have about 100 of them every session, just the roll call machine. So thank you for that. It was that small group of people who decided that the Republicans would not support our nominee when Bill Gardner got elected Secretary of State. And that happened because the Republican nominee at the time didn't believe anybody under 30 should be in the House, so he wouldn't talk to you. Literally would not talk to you. So it's pretty easy when he asked for my support to say, I don't even know who you are. And Bill Gardner became Secretary of State. It's been an honor during the 90s and the 2000s to work with both parties when we were challenged on each side about the primary day. And we have a great tradition in the Republican Party, whether it's your national committeeman, committeewoman, or state chairman, of being neutral. And I cannot tell you how many candidates like Alan Keyes, or Steve Forbes, or Senator Rand, or any one of the other people who say in New Hampshire, because you stay neutral, we're given a fair chance. And that's a very important part of the primary that helps us keep it to this day. I will tell you from every Republican chairman or committee man goes to the national committee, we say, New Hampshire is important. They go, yeah. You're from New Hampshire. You say that. I got a chance to experience that firsthand when McCain almost dropped out in 2007, that nobody would work for him. I was cheap. That means nothing. And we'd drive around in my Suburban. We did the No Surrender Tour, which was an excuse to go into every VFW and Legion because we knew there'd be some guys in the bar. I could set them up, and in exchange for which they'd go into the meeting room, listen to him, and it looked like we had a crowd. He crawled back and he asked if I would go with him. Probably a bad decision on his part, but I did. And what I learned, which really is the truth, that once you leave New Hampshire, personal contact with a voter ends. When we get to South Carolina and Florida and Michigan, it was all airport tarmac, TV studio, big rally. There was never an occasion where somebody could come up in tears saying, how are you going to help me pay my medical bills? Like that famous story when Bill Clinton was confronted with someone. So the real value of the New Hampshire primary isn't because we're in New Hampshire, even though we'd never let Vermont have it. It isn't upside down state. It isn't because we're special. It's because New Hampshire, even more than Iowa, but Iowa and New Hampshire are the only places where a candidate actually has to listen to voters. And it makes every single candidate a better candidate, and it makes he or she a better president when that happens. So the primary is important. It was great to be part of a tribe that had some fun trying to save it, and it's great to celebrate that and see so many old friends. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Next up is Howard Altschiller of the Portsmouth Herald, who's going to give us a journalistic perspective.
Well, as a journalistic perspective, I RSVP'd that I was going to come and cover this event before Memorial Day. Then I booted up my email this morning and said, oh, would you give a couple remarks? And I was not expecting to be standing in this room at this time, but I'm very honored to do it, and I'm honored to be here for Jim, who, if you go through the history of the state of the past 50 years, if you go through the history of Portsmouth, he's there, not just there, but like leading for everything. You know, we're talking about the primary today, but same-sex marriage in the state, the Martin Luther King holiday, Jim was the leader on that. I've joked that he's the Forrest Gump of New Hampshire, and he doesn't particularly like that, but I do, so I'm going to stick with it.
I like the candies.
There you go. So now let's see, I did put a couple of comments together, and there we go. So the primaries, obviously we cover the primaries as journalists, and we've had all kinds of really exciting moments. You know, you think of Hillary Clinton at Cafe Prego dropping the mask, showing some emotion that people felt really contributed to her win in 2008. Think about Jeb Bush standing in front of a room, waiting for, giving what he thinks is a killer line to dead silence and saying, this is where you applaud, this is where you laugh, and not getting anywhere. But, I think one of the things that we do that maybe is a little different is that we host the presidential candidates when they come through. Not everybody can afford the ticket to go to Mar-a-Lago or a George Clooney event at Madison Square Garden, and our events are free, and we try to make it as accessible as possible for all the voters in New Hampshire to meet the candidates and to share what's deeply in their heart. And when that happens, magical things can happen. I'm thinking in 2016, I really feel like the voters in New Hampshire, as candidates were traveling the state and hearing again and again and again about the opioid crisis, I felt like we helped put that on the map, and that became an important issue. And it remains an important issue, but one that I feel like we've made some progress on. After all these years, I don't take for granted the opportunity to speak with the men and women who are running for president, and even those who are long shots usually have something compelling to say. And I'm thinking here about Andrew Yang and his pitch for universal basic income. It's kind of an interesting concept. My favorite cycle was the run-up to the 2008 when we hosted events for Obama, McCain, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and we did them in our old press room. So those photos would be great historic relics in the not-so-distant future. This past cycle, we did a series of candidate town halls at the historic Exeter Town Hall. Great turnout and participation, particularly for Nikki Haley, who drew an overflow crowd, and Vivek Ramaswamy and Mike Pence. And I'm sorry we didn't have a robust Democratic primary in 2024. And hopefully the lesson from that decision is that the vetting of candidates early by everyday voters absolutely has the ability to expose a candidate's strengths and weaknesses before they step onto center stage. So hopefully some lessons are learned, and we'll carry those into 2028. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Howard. Before we move on to congressional messages, I see Anthony Stevens is here. Anthony was in the legislature when the bill passed. I don't know if you want to say a couple words, Anthony, or just wave. I'll wave. Anybody else that was here at the time that the bill was signed into law? Okay. So with that, we do have some letters from our congressional delegation, starting off with Senator Jean Shaheen.
Hi everyone, Senator Shaheen could not attend today, but she asked me to pass along this message on her behalf. Dear friends, I join you all in spirit today as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the law codifying New Hampshire's first in the nation presidential primary. The New Hampshire primary started as an effort to return the democratic process to the voters and expand access beyond big party bosses. The direct voter contact that New Hampshire provides, as well as the political culture of high voter engagement with candidates, puts those seeking office through their paces and compels meaningful answers to voters' questions. Our state has cultivated a process and atmosphere that is uniquely positioned to host the kind of contest that makes all politics, even the race for president, local. It also sends a message to all candidates that the people are the true source of power in our government. Thank you to everyone here today for your tireless efforts to preserve this proud tradition. Sincerely, Jean Shaheen.
Next up, we'll hear from Senator Maggie Hassan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Corey Gary with the Senator, and unfortunately she couldn't be here, but she asked that I read this letter on her behalf. So, dear friends, I'm sorry that I can't be with you today, but I join you in celebrating the 50th anniversary of HB 73, legislation that helped cement our First in the Nation presidential primary. New Hampshire does democracy better than anywhere else. From town meetings to our citizen legislature, grandstanders of all ages know that each of us have the capacity to make a difference for our country. It was the civic engagement of the grandstanders in the early 20th century that helped create the modern primary process, and 50 years ago, New Hampshire solidified its role in the process. The size of our state empowers candidates, no matter their financial resources, to engage with voters, and those voters, in turn, require candidates to answer direct questions. This direct person-to-person engagement ensures that candidates are responsive to the needs of all types of Americans. Thank you to everyone gathered here today for taking the time to show your neighbors in our country the civic spirit at the core of New Hampshire. I look forward to working with everyone as New Hampshire continues to serve this important role in the democratic process. With every good wish, Senator Maggie Hassan.
Thank you, and before we close, I'd like to give credit for the cake that we're all going to enjoy shortly, and Anna, do you know who made the cake?
It was Denise Nickerson.
Thank you, Denise. We're all going to enjoy it. I'd also like to thank the First in the Nation Presidential Primary Committee, which is being headed up by Chris Ager. Chris, I don't know where you went, but thank you for helping to organize this event. And with that, I'd like to thank our guests for making this a special day, and we'll end the formal part of the meeting, and hopefully we can socialize a bit and enjoy some cake and some refreshments. Thank you for coming.